back to the Notary Podcast, hosted by me, Daniel Lewis, found exclusively on YouTube. I'm so happy to see everybody back today. And today, the topic is going to be fantastic. In fact, it's going to be one of the topics that's going to be really help you, whether you are a new notary on this podcast or a very seasoned notary. And this is a topic that we don't really talk about a whole lot as notaries. I see a lot of podcasts that talk about marketing, branding, how to get business and that type of thing. But I believe, being a 21-year-old veteran of this, well, more than 21 years now, a veteran of being a notary entrepreneur, that one of the things we don't talk about, but I talk about in my workshops and my classes, and whenever I do keynote speaking, I always talk about de-escalation. So that's the topic today, de-escalate. And it's important, especially if you're a new notary, because as the notary in a transaction, you are the neutral party. You're the person that's bringing in the documents. You're the person that's neutral. You're not there to sell a product or of any kind. You're there to make sure the person who's signing is a meeting of the minds, and you're there to make sure the person who's signing is actually, they are not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. You properly identify them. You're going to make sure they're mentally competent. You're going to, and also you're going to make sure that person is not being coerced in any way. So we're going to talk about de-escalation in transactions, because sometimes a lot of you out there are looking to become a notary signing agent, dealing with a lot of real estate transactions. Some of you may just want to do remote online notary service that the person that's signing doesn't necessarily like the terms of the contract that they're signing. Real estate notaries, you're dealing with sometimes many parties in that transaction. You might be dealing with the listing agent, the buyer's agent, the seller's agent, the buyer's attorneys, the seller's attorneys, the buyers themselves, the sellers. So there's a lot of moving parts in transactions, and sometimes people, for whatever reason, are not agreeing on terms, or when they come to the closing table, have still some issues that can escalate into a big blown out thing. So I'm going to go over some ways you can de-escalate. And let me give you some examples, and I'll give you some examples as I go over some things, how to de-escalate a situation. And when I talk about escalating situations, it's where, let me give you an example. Recently, we had a great notary meetup in our office in beautiful Carmel, Indiana. It was one of my, a notary that came to that meetup, one of my fraternity brothers, Larry Dobson, came and he told a story of a notarization he did that week before, where it could have escalated into something really big. So shout out to you, Larry. And this is what the story told, and hopefully I'm telling it right and I'm not messing this up, Larry. He said there was a signing on a real estate property where the couple was getting divorced, and the husband was supposed to get about $47,000. At the husband's closing, as he was going through the documents, signing the documents, he realized he didn't agree with the terms of the loan package. So what he did was jumped up in front of the notary into Larry's space, took the documents and just ripped them up in front of him, almost like he was challenging him to a duel, the notary to a duel. And Larry, of course, being an experienced notary, kept his calm, stayed seated, called the title company, let them know the situation, and just kept calm during the whole thing. That's just one example of how things can escalate. I mean, he really got up in Larry's face saying, "I don't like this," and rip it up. Can you imagine that? Or some people can't imagine that. So I'm going to go over some things, how you can de-escalate a situation like that. Because it's important as notaries, because you're the notary, you're the professional in the room. You want to keep that in mind. You're the professional. The first thing, if you ever get into a situation, whether it's a real estate assignment, a power of attorney, I've done many thousands of powers of attorneys in hospital rooms, nursing homes, assisted living, where people just can't agree on who's going to be the power of attorney or whether they should have a power of attorney at all. And it can get pretty testy. But the first thing you do as the notary, and here's the number one thing you want to do, you want to remain calm and composed. You are the professional there. You want to remain calm and composed. No matter what the situation, remain calm and composed. I usually take a couple of deep breaths when things start trickling up, that temperature in the room of attitudes start trickling up. I just try to remain calm and composed. I might even take a couple of deep breaths and just recenter myself and remain calm and composed. So that's the first thing you want to do when things start to escalate. The second thing you want to do is you want to definitely do this. You want to listen actively to each and all parties. Sometimes you can de-escalate just by listening, just by letting them show the parties that you're listening to them, and you're listening and acknowledging what they say. So listening actively. And when I say listening actively, I'm talking about making eye contact. When they hit their point of discontent, you're nodding, not saying you agree with whatever their point of discontention, but you're nodding, saying, okay, I'm understanding, I'm listening to you, I'm letting you know that I am 100% listening and involved into your point of view. So listening actively is a big point in the de-escalating situations. The third thing, and I mentioned this before, acknowledge their emotion. Don't talk over the person. Don't say, even if you think in a situation it's totally they're totally wrong or their point of view is totally in error, acknowledge their emotion in that point. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was in a closing, and it was a situation where it was a refinance, and the person, as we were going through the documents, had a question about one of the documents. So they asked me, and it had to do with the financial product of that document. So of course I said, hey, that's a great question, and this is usually how I answer. That's a great question. Let's call your loan officer and see how they would approach that particular answer to your question. So we called the loan officer. Of course, his administrative assistant or an administrative assistant answered the phone. I said, okay, hey, I'm sitting here with John Doe borrower, or John Smith and Betty Smith borrower. I have you on speakerphone. I need to talk to the loan officer of this, Joe Smith. And he said, oh, yeah, I'll go get Joe. Joe comes on the phone. I tell Joe again, I'm sitting here with John Doe and Betty Doe, borrower. They have a question about the loan product here. I have you on speaker phone. And of course, that loan officer, I don't know if he was doing multiple things, multitasking during that conversation, but while the loan officer was on speaker phone and the borrower was there, the signers was there, the loan officer said, oh, that dumb borrower, he keeps asking me these stupid questions right there, right then and there. And I said, you're on speakerphone here, and it was a very awkward rest of that closing. So after he hung up, I acknowledged, said, hey, you know what, he might have made a mistake in what he was saying. Of course, the signers were very hot at that time, but I acknowledged their emotion, acknowledged their frustration, but we did complete the closing. That was one of the most awkward closings I've completed, but in those situations, you just sometimes have to just acknowledge the emotion of the parties and to move forward and definitely actively listen. You also have to clarify any misunderstandings during any type of transactions, any misunderstandings. A lot of times when I'm in hospitals, nursing homes, orthopedics, hospitals, heart hospitals, and there's a power of attorney, and I get called usually by a loved one and say, hey, we need to do a healthcare power of attorney. I get to the hospital, I make sure they have the power of attorney. I ask my rounding questions of the patient that's there, like their date of birth, do they know who the loved one is? And sometimes, a lot of times, there's a misunderstanding with the loved one who says, I'm going to be the power of attorney, I'm going to be that person's agent. And then the person in the hospital, the person at a nursing home say, well, no, my idea was to have some other person be the power of attorney. So you got to acknowledge, oh, this is a misunderstanding, and sometimes you have to let them give them a couple of moments to figure out who's going to be who without the signer being coerced or forced to sign something they don't want to sign. So acknowledge misunderstandings and clarify misunderstandings. May be a better way to say it. You also want to focus when things start to escalate. You want to focus on your procedures, what you need to do. Sometimes when I go to a closing, real estate closing, or even just a regular notary, traditional notary assignment, and I clarify before I get there, hey, I need certain type of identification, something that's specified by the state that says if I use this identification, it will be a good way to verify that is who that person is. And I clarify that over the phone. They have to have that sometimes, and not always. Just as an example, I'll get there and they say, well, I don't have any ID, but you can see this is me. And the person doesn't understand that you have to have proper identification to proceed on that transaction. So focus, and they escalate the situation. They'll say, hey, why don't you just have me sign this and you see it's me and just notarize it? So you got to focus on the procedure. Usually in that case, just since I used that example, I always ask notaries who come to my workshops and my classes and come see me speak, they always need to have their manual, their state manual in their book. And their state manual will always outline what is proper identification. So if we're in those situations, I always pull out that state manual, I always have it in my notary bag, a state guidelines. So, in ours, it's on page 21. Here's what I need to see for proper identity. Always focus on the procedures, what the proper procedures are, and if at all possible, have either the manual or some type of best practices guides in your notary bag, so you can actually show the person, instead of you going back and forth saying, no, you have to have this. You can actually show that person what the state guidelines are. And that's such a big help, because it takes you out of the escalating and say, hey, I usually empathize with the person. I wish I can just say, I can look at you and say, yeah, you're you, let's sign. But here's the guidelines. I have to follow these guidelines in order for me to keep my commission. Hopefully that's resonating and that makes sense. So focus on procedure. Focus on your state procedure. Next thing, and this is the sixth thing, using neutral language. Use language that is very, very neutral. Even when you're giving, a good example of that, when you're giving an oath or affirmation, I usually use neutral language on that, because some people, when you say, do you swear to tell the truth or the whole truth, some people have objection to the word swear. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, when I'm giving an oath or affirmation? Or do you swear or affirm that by signing this, this is true and accurate document that you're signing, what's contained in here? So you try to stay with neutral language. Avoid inflammatory or judgmental language. if all possible. That'll keep you from having things escalate in closings or in notary assignments. Offer solutions. And this is something that I've learned how to do very effectively. Offer solutions. As notaries, a lot of people say, well, if they ask me about my interest rate or if they ask me about a certain part of the loan product, how do I offer solutions if I have no experience, or if it's a loan product that has some type of special product to it, where there's some loan products that communities offer that says, if you take this loan and you stay in this house, for example, for a certain amount of time and pay the loan off continuously on time, you forgive certain parts of the loan. So it's a lot of different things in transactions that you, as the notary who gets the documents maybe 20 minutes before the closings or before the transaction, that you might not be aware of. And a person may ask you, hey, I got a question about this loan product. Hey, I got a question about taxes. Hey, I got a question about my homeowners association. Hey, I got a question about the numbers on close. How did they come up with these numbers? Offer solutions. And the way I offer solutions, I usually say, let's say it's a question about the loan product. Say, hey, you know what? That's a great question. Let's call your loan officer to see exactly how they would answer that question. About title. Hey, that's a great question. Why don't we get your title processor, the person that processed this and put your numbers together. Let's get them on the phone and see exactly how they came up with these numbers. I never say, and these words can really escalate a situation. Oh, I have no idea what's going on. When you say that, that gives off an impression immediately from the signers that, hey, they send someone who's unprofessional, who's not familiar with the product, they don't know what they're doing, and they actually put that on the feedback in the survey forms they have right after the closing. So my recommendation as a professional notary entrepreneur, never, ever say, I have no idea. I don't know what's going on with that. I've never seen that before. Never use that type of language in transactions. Always use affirming language like, you know what, that's a great question. First of all, you're agreeing with the signer, and then next you say, let's get another resource on the phone. A lot of notaries sometimes they don't want to do that because I think they just want to feel like I need to be able to answer every single question about every single loan product that comes across the table. But you don't have to do that. Get an expert, get an authority figure, a person that put the loan together, a person that put the financial product together, has a unique training, a specified training about the financial product. Get them on the phone and move forward. So make sure you offer solutions that way instead of trying to be the expert in all fields. It just makes more sense. And also getting those other people on the phone in a professional manner, it really builds that relationship between the loan officers, title companies, and you. So the next thing you want to do is, if you have a situation that does escalate, did you find yourself, oh man, this is escalating and escalating and escalating. A good example of that would be a lot of times when you do closings with couples, for example. If you do a closing with a couple, usually what I find when closings with couples, one of the parties in the couple has done most of the communications between the loan officer, most of the communications between the title companies. So the other party may not be as familiar with the loan terms. So at the closing, that'll be the first time they see the loan terms or the transactions and the terms of that transaction. And they sometimes get furious at their couple. So sometimes that can lead to a situation where at the closing things escalate. Sometimes you need to, in those cases where I've seen that, sometimes you can just say, hey, do one of these. Let's take a time out. Let's stop the closing for a second. Let's all get back, recompose. The terms aren't changing, and because the closing isn't a part of the negotiation of that agreement. The closing is where you meet the minds. So sometimes you may have to say, hey, let's take a time out. Let's back up and let's start again in a few minutes. Let everybody take a couple deep breaths and let's start again. So sometimes in a closing, if things escalate, don't be afraid to say, hey, time out. Let's take a time out. Let's step back and come back at it in 5-10 minutes. Take a little breather. So don't be afraid to do that as the notary signing agent. Something else that I really like this other rule, and I've used this before, you definitely want to take and respect the other person's boundaries. No matter who the person is, they have a certain point of view. If they don't, because sometimes people who, for example, are in a closing, or you're supposed to go do a closing with somebody, and they have very low communication between the title company and the loan officer, but you're the first person they see in this transaction, they want to take out their frustrations if they don't agree with the loan terms on you sometimes as a notary. But you just got to respect their boundaries. Make sure you respect their personal space, respect their boundaries. As we said before, acknowledge their emotions, be active listening, and just make sure you respect their boundaries. Don't come up in an aggressive way to a signer. Just respect who they are, and that can really help de-escalate a situation. Next thing, and a final thing I want to say is when you have something that's is escalating out of control, whether they don't believe with the terms, they don't like each other. Sometimes you get in closings and people are ex-spouses, or they might be even relatives that they don't agree with. You got to seek assistance when needed. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and say, hey, I need some clarification on this homeowners association, or taxes, or the back taxes, or I need clarification on this aspect of the closing. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and seek assistance. Now, one caveat to that, in some states, there is additional training that's required for you to do any type of real estate closings. So a lot of times, you as the notary, like Indiana and Maryland, we are title producers licensed state. You should be more of the expert at the closing procedures, what IDs you should have, what to do if they don't have IDs. You should be the expert. But if it's a question about the loan product itself, the numbers, how the title company came up with the numbers, if it's questions about that, loan terms, anything like that, don't feel that you can't pick up the phone, because all closing documents have some numbers in there that, hey, if this happens, call this number. Have a question about loan product, call this number. Don't feel like you have to muscle your way through each assignment, if that makes sense. Feel comfortable picking up the phone and calling title companies. Now, I wouldn't recommend calling the title companies and say, hey, what ID should I take? You should, as the notary, you should have that in your notary guide, and you should be able to, some things you should be able to research for yourself. But like I said, once again, loan terms, numbers on there, like homeowner association, taxes, you should be comfortable calling if the signer has any questions. Now, for me, just personally, the number one way to de-escalate situations is make sure, and I've talked about this in other podcasts, take your meds. That means you meditate. I mean, before you go into closing, you prepare your mind for every possible scenario, whether they are people that get misinformation from the loan officer. Like, for example, one situation is the loan officer to tell somebody who's refinancing their house that, hey, you're going to get, and they're getting a check at the end of the closing, they're getting money back. I've seen situations where the loan officer told the signer, oh, you get the check at the end of the closing, which means to a layperson, oh, after this notary brings the paperwork, they're going to hand me a check. The loan officer didn't mention the 3-day right to rescind. So there's a situation where a notary came in, the guy asked for the check, the signer asked for the check, and the notary said, I don't have a check, and then escalated immediately. So you got to prepare yourself. A couple of other little quick tips. Take your meds, meditation. Before I go on any closing, I always take a couple of deep breaths, recenter myself before each closing to make sure I am centered and I'm not going to escalate. I'm trying to prepare myself for any possible scenario. Make sure you do daily exercise. That's meditation, then exercise. Your meds. Exercise doesn't have to mean you have to go in and do hour worth of high intensity aerobics or hot yoga for hours and hours. It means maybe take a walk every day about 20 minutes and just recenter yourself. And then make sure you're having the proper diet. You're not loading up on sugars where you're taking your blood sugar in your body out of whack. So you are groggy during the closing, or you're taking caffeine and you're way too hyped up during the closing. So make sure you meditate, exercise, diet, have a nice balanced diet. And then you got to make sure you get proper sleep. If you don't get proper sleep, you're going to be, whether you believe it or not, you can get irritated, and just any little thing can make you snap. So you want to make sure you get proper sleep. I would recommend 6 to 8 hours a night. Get proper sleep, because you're going to be in with signers with a lot of different personalities, and you definitely want to make sure you at the top of your game. You get plenty of sleep. So you're going to take your meds, meditation, exercise, diet, and proper sleep to make sure you don't be in a situation where you unwittingly are starting to escalate things in your life. Now, by employing these strategies, a notary can effectively de-escalate tense situations during transactions, ensuring a professional and successful outcome. Definitely want to employ these, and hopefully you liked this podcast today. I try to keep it nice and short and sweet and informative. If you like this podcast, make sure you like and share and subscribe to this podcast. Definitely subscribe to this podcast. We love doing this podcast for you. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, or if you have any techniques that you use to de-escalate situations during the closings, I want to hear from you. Put them in the comments, and I will definitely comment back on that. Well, I want to hear from you. So make sure you if you like this podcast today, share, and subscribe. Share it in your groups. Really want to hear from you. Really want to hear from groups. And I hope to see you next week, because we're going to have a fantastic podcast next week. We're going to get on the road, and I'm going to be interviewing some other notaries. So I can't wait to see you next week. See you next week. Have a great day.